Okay, so I think we are live now.
Uh, Let me check 1 second.
Karthik?
Yes.
Hello, everybody, and good afternoon, good evening to everyone. We are incredibly, it's a very somber moment that we are all gathered here to talk about the unjust incarceration of Shafiqul Islam Kajol, a journalist and editor of Daily Pokhokal, Bengali newspaper and magazine in Bangladesh. And Mr. Mr. Kajol was, he disappeared on 10th of March this year, and after 53 days of absolutely no whereabouts, he resurfaced at the Anglo-Bangladesh border and was taken away by Bangladeshi forces. And ever since, he has been, he has not been allowed to be with his family. We had a hearing today. There was a hearing in which he got 2-day police remand, and the charges against him, he has been booked under the Digital Security Act of 2018, a law which has been widely banned both in Bangladesh as well as outside of it. It's and Shafiqul's arrest is symptomatic of what is going on in Bangladesh at the moment. There is a lot of curb on freedom of speech. There is so many journalists are being rounded up, bloggers are being rounded up, and there's also the issue of enforced disappearances of political dissenters. So as we sort of gather here to talk about, and talk about the issue that, that's made Kajol go behind bars, we are joined in by a very wonderful panel, of speakers. We are joined in by Monoram Polok, who is the son of Shafiqul Islam Kajol, and who is hosting the Facebook page Where is Kajol, to talk about the urgent issues surrounding Kajol's incarceration. We are also joined in by Salil Tripathi, who is a veteran journalist and award-winning writer. He is also the chairperson of Writers in Prison Committee of the PEN International. Welcome, Salil. We are also happy to have Meenakshi Ganguly of the South Asia Director of Human Rights Watch. Then we have Stephen Butler, who is the Asia Coordinator of Committee to Protect Journalists. Thank you, Stephen, for joining us. We have Saad Hamadi, very kind of him to join us. He represents the Amnesty International, South Asia campaigner for Amnesty International. We also have Dr. Halima Begum, who is the non-executive director for Labour Campaign on Human Rights, as well as the chair of the Women's Environmental Network in the UK. We also have Alana Travers, who's the vice chair of the Labour Campaign for Human Rights in the UK. Thank you all for joining in, and welcome to everybody. I will now let Monoram say a few words about his father's disappearance and eventual incarceration. And from then onwards, we will sort of have, speakers talk about this very urgent issue. So Monoram, please.
Thank you, Anshulanta. I'm really not in the greatest spot right now. I will try my best. So I woke up today with a text from a journalist. The text had 2 words. It read, "Stay strong." Uh, I knew it by then what just happened with us. I got to know within a minute that they have given 2 days of remand of my 52 years old photojournalist and editor father, Shafiqul Islam Kajol. My immediate response was, what should we do now? Some said to go to the detective branch office at Mintu Road. Some said to go to the police station where the case was filed. Some said to call the Hazaribagh station. The irony is I don't know where in Minto Road I should have gone, maybe. When I would reach there at some point, what should I do? What do I ask there and to whom? I have no idea what's going on with us. I have lost the grasp of reality. This all seemed like a lie to me. Every time, whenever there is an update in my father's case, there will be countless phone calls from journalists to my mother's phone on my or mine. Today, there were none. We know it by now that this remand is only for us, Kajol and Kajol's family. We will not be able to share this with anyone. My mother was asking me, "What do we do? What did we do?" Without asking for his freedom. What else could have we done as a family? My father has compromised immune system. He has underlying health issues. Uh, Last time when I saw him in Joshua jail, he was mentally and physically tempered. He won't survive remand. He won't probably survive COVID-19. Today, suddenly my father was allowed to make one phone call to us. He called us, and after speaking for a brief moment, he told me, "Abba খুব মারবে মনে হচ্ছে," basically saying that, addressing me, he just said he thinks he's going to be tortured, beaten. My father was in Joshua jail for 52 days after being disappeared for 53 days. He was in Joshua jail for 52 days without any arrest under the Digital Security Act cases. After 52 days, he was shown arrested in one of the cases, and now, 5 days later, after 57 days of being in jail, he is arrested in the second Digital Security Act case, which also gave 2 days in remand to the detective branch. He was missing for 53 days since before that. For over 110 days, what we have been going through, only Allah knows. We won't be able to tell you, as we don't know what we are going through. It's so surreal. If we are lucky and able to survive this level of oppression in coming years, we will understand what just happened to us, and this ever lasting trauma will haunt us throughout our lifetime. Still, I am proud to be a Bangladeshi and proudly representing my country with you all today. I hope the Prime Minister of Bangladesh will see my father's case and consider my journalist and editor father's age, his profession, and above all, the pandemic. Like the father of our nation, our father, my father, is really dear to us. We cannot imagine a single second without my Baba Kajol. That's all I have to say for now.
Thank you, Polok. That was a very heartening, uh, you know, recap of what you have gone through. It's not easy to be here. So, uh, while that may be the case, it's also extremely important to talk about the politics surrounding and leading up to the incarceration of Shafiqul Islam Kajol, your father. And we have Salil Tripathi, who's been a veteran journalist, and he has already written a book on Bangladesh Liberation War, The Colonel Who Will Not Repent. It's a wonderful book. And thank you, Salil, for joining us. Uh, we are really eager to sort of hear from you the context, the larger political context of cracking down on dissenters, bloggers, and the difference between that you've already pointed out the difference between state and non-state actors, and how does it all play out in Bangladesh, and what really led to the disappearance and then imprisonment of Kajol. Over to you, Sadiq.
Thank you. And first of all, Polok, that was very, very profoundly moving. And anything that we say is going to be superfluous. The only thing we can do is to express our support and solidarity and the hope that the context that we will now provide will be helpful in making sure that your father is back with your mother and you and your family very soon. I mean, that's the first thing I wanted to say at the outset. Um, I wish, I mean, at one level, one could argue that this is a unique case, which it is, but the sad reality is that it is not so unique. If we look at the Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International reports and concerns expressed about Bangladesh over the past few years, sudden disappearances, no information about where a person is, no information about what charges a person is being held under, is not, sadly, it is not unique. And the reason it is painful, and to see it in a historical context, is that Bangladesh was not meant to be like that. If we look at the history of the formation of the country, the circumstances in which it was created, it's very clear that it was created as a home in the subcontinent for people who spoke Bengali. And it was meant to be beyond sectarian concerns. It was meant to be not about a particular religion. One language was important, but the other languages were meant to be spoken if we go back to the independence era constitution. And things seem to be going in that direction till 1975. And then, of course, things have changed. Now, the last few years have been particularly problematic. And let me recount some of the faces and names, because we are not talking about numbers here. We are talking about actually individuals who are speaking out, who are dissenting, who are raising their voices. And unfortunately, it's a long story. I mean, if we go beyond journalism for a second and think of the story of Kalpana Chakma, we know that, there's some people who've been, Shahidul Alam has called them Kalpana's warriors, who have fought for her freedom. That is a reality about Bangladesh, about what the military can do. You mentioned bloggers, Amshukanta, and so, I mean, these are only names, but each name tells a story. Rajiv Haidar in 2013, Abhijit Roy in 2015, Washikur Rahman in March 2015, Niloy Neil, Anant Bijay Dash, Faisal Arif in Deepan, Nazimuddin Samad, Rezaul Karim Siddiqui, Zulfaz Manan. I mean, they are all not with us. And the reason is that they were writing things, publishing things, stating things, expressing their views, which somebody did not like. And I want to come about the state and non-state actor in a moment. And there is my friend Tutul, Amadur Rashid Tutul, who now lives in Norway, who runs this magazine Shuddashore, who has also, been not necessarily a victim of the act itself. There are two parts to the whole problem that is played out with digital security and internet and freedom of expression. There is the threat of the law, which people such as Kajol have faced, and other people who have made innocent sounding remarks on the internet. And there are threats that come from non-state actors, people who are extremists, who do not like rationalists, who do not like atheists, who do not like free thinkers, and they take out their anger through machetes and so on. And the state does not do much. It in fact perpetuates a climate of impunity by actually informing people not to do what they are doing. In particular, I know one particular blogger, a woman who wrote on religion and politics. And when she was being threatened, the first thing that the police told her is, of course, sensible advice that when you leave the house and come back, take a different route every day so that people can't predict, and leave at different times and come back at different times, which is sound advice. I mean, it's still not as reassuring as it ought to be, but it's sound advice. But then one of the police officers told her that, look, ma'am, you're a woman. Why don't you write on flowers and cooking and things like, why do you want to write about all this topic like religion and politics and women's rights? And I mean, first of all, it was not for him to say that about what she can or cannot blog. But this is the climate that we have to start watching our words and swallowing our words. And in that kind of a society, if someone does speak out something and does want to say something which is strongly worded but in a polite tone, then nothing offers you immunity. One of the jewels of Bangladesh is, of course, the writer and photographer Shahidul Alam, friend of mine. And at the time when those two students were killed by a runaway bus in Bangladesh in 2018, and people were out on the streets, and he went out and did some filming and spoke about it. The result was that he was arrested, he was tortured, he was beaten. He was in the same jail, I believe, Kiraniganj, if I'm not mistaken, where Kajol is right now. And he spent more than 100 days. And later he was treated well, but initially he was treated very, very shabbily. And at that time, of course, there was a concerted campaign to get him out. But the cycle of immunity and impunity that we are talking about continues to persist. The threats are from extremist groups, of course, but there are also threats from the state. I mean, the Daily Star newspaper, we all know the case about how many cases are being filed against the newspaper, under defamation laws, under all kinds of laws. The interpretation of application of sedition as a law, what you can and cannot say about the liberation war, what you can and cannot say about the number of people who had died during the war, all of that is creating a climate which is basically forcing people to swallow their words about what they can and cannot speak. And that actually, and this is my final thought, that Bangladesh is very much the home of Rabindranath Tagore, as it is of India. I mean, the one man to have written 2 national anthems of India and Bangladesh. And there's a statement that I grew up in India, and there's a poem of his which we speak about all the time, because we think that it essentially articulates the vision of what the country ought to be. And that, of course, everybody knows, Chitto Jatha Bhoyoshunno is the one I'm talking about, where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, where knowledge is free. Into that heaven of freedom, my father, let my country awake. He wasn't only speaking about India. He wasn't speaking only about Bengal. Clearly, he meant it for the whole world, but it absolutely applies as much to Bangladesh. And what people in Bangladesh have to examine, ask themselves and think is what has become of the country, what it was meant to be in 1971, where has it come, and what can be done to retrieve it. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Salil, for summing it up. And as you said, that the larger context has been brewing for some time, and the character of the persecution has just changed hands. It hasn't really sort of become any different for writers and bloggers and atheists and political opinionators and journalists. They have been facing persecution for a pretty long time, and it's just intensified now. Stephen Butler from the Committee to Protect Journalists is here. And Stephen, PPJ has done a lot of research into Digital Security Act per se. And you're here to talk about the journalists who have been targeted under this very draconian law, very controversial law. So over to you. And we want to hear what this is all about.
Thank you. And I would just also echo what Salil said, that my heart goes out to Pollock and his family. And our goal is to try to get Kajol out of jail one way or the other. But it's unfortunate that he's by far not the only victim, of this law or this tradition. And I want to make a single point here, which is that defamation should never be a criminal offense. Journalists should never go to jail over defamation charges. There is a role for civil remedies in the case of defamation, but it should never be criminal, not only in Bangladesh, but everywhere in the world. CPJ has documented the misuse of defamation laws in Bangladesh, against journalists for many years. The most absurd case I ever came across was in July of 2017. It was a journalist named Abdul Latif Moral who was jailed for a factual but likely sarcastic tweet about a minister who gave goats to farmers, and some died. He wrote a newspaper story about it, which was fine, but once it went online, it became subject to Section 57 of the Information and Communication Act, which is the predecessor to the Digital Security Act. But one of the most surprising and disturbing facts about this case is that it was filed by a fellow journalist who was a supporter of the minister, in this case. So there's a kind of, I think, a lack of awareness too among journalists about how dangerous these laws are and how inappropriate they are. Later in that year, I was in Dhaka and I met with the information minister, Hassan al-Haq, and he admitted to me at the time that Section 57 of the law had been abused, particularly by local police authorities. to jail journalists. And he made a promise to me that that the shortcomings in the law would be remedied. At that time, the Digital Security Act was being drafted. He did not promise to decriminalize defamation, but he did say that the law would be used very rarely against journalists, only after a panel of expert journalists decided that it was appropriate. Of course, that never happened. On September 18th, 2018, Parliament passed the Digital Security Act after ignoring repeated requests for consultation and revisions by journalists in Bangladesh. We at that time sent a letter to the president of Bangladesh asking that it be held up for review. That didn't happen. It became law, and this horrible act is now in force. What we feared might come to pass has actually happened. The law is being used as a weapon against journalists in the normal course of their reporting. And as a consequence, it's a weapon to instill fear in all journalists. If you visit newsrooms in Bangladesh, you will find people saying, yes, we self-censor. We cannot report the news because we're afraid of what will happen. And those fears are well justified. Of course, we all understand the outrageous abuse of the law in the case of Kajol. But there are so many other cases that have not received this kind of prominence. Jailed in early May under the DSA was a political cartoonist named Kabir Kashur and the writer Mushtaq Ahmed for allegedly spreading rumors and carrying out anti-government activities. What's their sin? It was to raise questions about the government's response to COVID-19. Kishore was drawing cartoons of ruling party leaders, and they were accused of tarnishing the image of the country and creating confusion among the public. In a few days, we will be publishing actually a much more extensive investigation into many of the cases that we have uncovered. We started looking into this a few weeks ago, all right, and it was like turning over rocks and finding more and more underneath it. There are just so many cases that have gone under the radar, and it's been actually very difficult to document them. When we publish a case, we use the traditional news reporting standards, which are at least 2 independent sources confirming the facts. But as we began looking into this, the list got longer and longer and longer, and much of that will be coming out in the next couple of days. But there was an investigation. It was on April 14th, an arrest of Golam Sarwar Pintu for writing about protests over food during the coronavirus lockdown. And on April 19th, there was an investigation of the DSA, under the DSA, launched against 5 journalists from BD24 News. And this includes Tawfiq Imros Khalidi, the editor of the site. And they also reported a misappropriation of rice. We document at least 8 other cases on the Digital Security Act. And this doesn't include journalists who've been arrested under the act for Facebook posts that are not strictly related to their work as journalists. In addition, aside from the DSA, we document many cases of physical attacks on journalists, for their reporting. As far as creating confusion, which is what the government is charged, the real confusion here is the understanding by the government of the role of a free press in society, which is to keep the government honest by issuing fact-based critical reports. Journalism is not a crime. And I repeat my first point, which is that defamation should never land a journalist in jail. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. That was very enlightening. And as you rightly pointed out, Kajol is not the only one. There have been several cases, and at times there is not even a legal FIR. As exactly was the case with Kajol for several days. He was just kept in jail without any warrant, without any FIR, and eventually, before he was produced in court, suddenly there was, he was charged on the GSA. There is also physical assaults on various people, and as Sadhamadi from Amnesty would tell us now, there's also the case of enforced disappearance. People just simply disappear. They vanish from the streets. They just vanish from their houses is taken away, in the middle of the night or in the daylight or any time, and they are never heard from again. And it's not just about journalists; it's also about barristers, human rights activists in Bangladesh, writers, anybody who's remotely inconveniencing in either the government or anybody in power. Sir, over to you, and you could just give us, what transpired in Kajol's case and how is import disappearance a menace that is happening in Bangladesh.
Thank you, Anshukanta. I'm sorry if you, I'm not sure if are you able to hear now? Yeah. So, no, I'd like to start off by saying the fact that I'm probably the only other Bangladeshi other than Monoram Polok in this panel of speakers. And I hold a green passport. As I speak, I do have my concerns about the consequences of the law that we're talking about today. I have very closely monitored over the last 2 years since this law was brought into practice. This is not the first time. It has been replaced. So the ICT Act that Stephen Butler was talking about, Information and Communication Technology Act, which was introduced in 2006 by a different government, and then it started coming into function and practice over the course of time. It was amended in 2009, and then in 2013, the Section 57 has been that one provision that was broad and could take anyone in prison for whatever they expressed under whichever condition that anyone would file the case, whatever justification they would give. It really was that broad that it never made any sense. My earlier speakers have mentioned about some of the examples of people who've been taken into custody, have been filed under that case, under that law. And then we have the Digital Security Act after many years. And in between, we've heard from ministers that the ICT Act will be changed, it will be amended, made people-friendly, not just journalists, but no one will be harassed for expressing themselves. It had some hope. The purpose of the Digital Security Act, as the government, policymakers, and proponents of the government explained at that time, was that this law will essentially tackle financial fraud and financial crime, which is legitimate, because in this digital space, in this digital age, you have various fraud. You've got credit card fraud, you've got all sorts of hacking, your own digital security and concerns. But within that law, you've got provisions that are now widely being used to curb freedom of expression, to curb what you say. And it's outrageous the way the people are charged. I mean, people are arrested right and left. You don't know for what you speak and what you'd be arrested for, who will be hurt, and what the grounds will be put against, the reasoning that will be put against to arrest you in Bangladesh. And that's what alarms me most. I mean, I'm concerned all the time for what I speak and how that will be perceived. I have seen cases, I'm not going to mention names, but in the last few months, I've seen cases where people have been arrested for very trivial reasons. I mean, how should I put this? People have been arrested for expressing their opinion, for various reservations about actions of the government. It's not even news or fake news that is usually portrayed. It's not rumors, it's just opinion for which people are arrested. People are arrested on the ground that their statement could instigate violence without reasoning for how it could instigate, what are the grounds. I mean, in case of freedom of expression, as we know, as the international law suggests, the practice has to meet legality, necessity, and proportionality for any kind of restriction on freedom of speech. So when we talk about that proportionality or the necessity for an action, there isn't a basis that's given. When I have spoken to authorities, when I've spoken to the police for any arrests that have been made in the recent past months, the ground was that, well, the general secretary of the local of the local unit of the ruling party has come to the police station to file a case. I mean, what could be more concerning than not registering this case? Clearly, there is a reason that, to be worried about. That was the ground that a police officer in charge shared with me. So if a politician's visit to a police station is the ground for thinking that this is necessary, this is proportionate to arrest a person, send a person for jail in 23 days. This particular person that I'm talking about, who was eventually released on bail, fortunately, unlike some of the others, such as Kajol, as we see. I mean, this is worrying. Last week, we've seen a 15-year-old arrested for sharing a post on Facebook. What could be the reasons? Yes, it could be offensive, but offense is also supposed to be tolerated by public figures, as has been identified, as has been stated in the general comments of the freedom of speech that has been put out by the United Nations. So under those circumstances, it's deeply, the law is deeply problematic. It's horrifying. The pain that Pollock is going through and his father is going through can only be felt by those who have been in that shoes. But it's scary for others, for people like me, for people in the country, that if they speak, if they are critical, if they're expressing dissent, they will not be seen positively, they will not be welcomed. And if that's the case, then I don't think you have much space to express yourself. You don't have much space to have a different opinion. And that's not how a state should function. When this law was introduced, there have been concerns expressed by journalists, by editors, by the civil society experts as well, civil society members. And the idea behind it was that this will be taken into consideration, but the law was passed in such a hasty manner, and yet the ministers gave hope that this is not the end of the road. There will be provisions, there will be room to amend the provisions that the journalists are concerned about. But clearly that the Editors' Council at the time had said that they were worried. Their views were not taken into consideration. There were at least 8 provisions in the Digital Security Act that they wanted amendment, that they wanted change. Amnesty International has also done review of the Digital Security Act, and it has called on the Bangladesh government to at least repeal the provisions that are problematic, that has been expressed by the journalists themselves, that needs to be changed. And to date, that has not happened. I'm not sure if the senior leadership of the political structure of the ruling party is always involved in every case. But the worrying sign of this Digital Security Act is that when you have introduced an act like the Digital Security Act, it is no more in the control of the political structure of the mainstream of the senior leadership. It can be the grassroots member who are trying to impress their leaders by filing cases, hundreds of them, to arrest people. I've just come across in a recent report by a local human rights organization that 88 people have been arrested this year under the Digital Security Act for just expressing criticism of various kinds. 67 cases have been filed against journalists. So that's not a small number. That's worrying as it is. No individual should be persecuted for expressing themselves. And that's where I'd like to conclude at this time. I am quite upset by seeing the development of Kajol's case. I mean, 100 days without more than 100 days away from his family, over 53 days in suspected and forced disappearance. The government should have commissioned an investigation into where he has been and what has happened in those 53 days. But what we are seeing now is that there's further persecution going on for what he has shared on his Facebook. And is that all? So we can't use Facebook, we can't use Twitter, we can't use our social media to say whatever we feel like saying? Thank you.
Thank you, Saad. You really painted a very grim picture of it's the current Bangladesh, but the parallels with other countries in South Asia, especially mine, India at this point is just too stark. And Meenakshi, this is a very good time for you to bring in the larger resonances of what's going on in Bangladesh, with what's happening in India, in uh, in Pakistan, in Sri Lanka, and other countries where especially I would probably say one or two lines about India. What we are witnessing is horrifying. The number of FIRs, of first information reports filed against police, reports filed against journalists, just within 3 months, from March to June. Uh, I think over 50 FIRs were filed all over the country against journalists and editors of very reputed websites like Scroll.in, The Wire, and some of the best news websites is bringing in partial reportage of what's going on. Are being sort of filed against some of their best reporters and their editors uh, for covering whether it's COVID-19, the lapses, the governmental lapses in COVID-19, the environmental issues, the political scandals and corruption issues. In any case, in India, journalism is sort of split wide open between a very pro-government, pro-establishment, a big section of Indian media is very pro-establishment at the moment, while a tiny minority of Indian media is trying to sort of hold the fort, as it were, and trying to report accurately. I believe there's a similar situation in Pakistan as well, where TV channels are getting all kinds of governmental sanctions against them for holding discussions or on the sort of channels and other things. We also have activists in India, civil rights activists facing very draconian charges against them, like the UAPA or even sedition charges or the NSA, which is the National Security Act. All very, very serious, charges, which and NSA is almost tantamount to waging war against the nation, or sedition is tantamount to waging war against the nation. These are really, really serious charges that are pressed against journalists for organizing rallies, organizing rallies like protesting against the the CAA, or the Citizenship Amendment Act. Uh, what do you have to sort of say? That do you see are these just parallels? Are these parallels just coincidences, or there's a larger South Asian reality that we must talk about at this point?
Thank you. Yes, of course, there's not just a South Asian reality to talk about. There's a reality all around to talk about. We have the president of the US talking about fake news routinely. We have China doing what it does. We have these standards. China has just responded to 50 UN experts saying that it was interfering in their internal affairs. So no, I mean, it's not. This is a growing problem around the world. We are finding governments who are abusive, very anxious to hide their abuses, and therefore in any kind of criticism will be responded with excesses, and they often use that in something that Salil talked about, in the sort of when the blogger cases were happening in Bangladesh. Quite often the government, we spoke to the government about it, they would say, well, they should be a little bit more careful about not offending sentiment. Now, that offending sentiment or outraging feelings is something that we are seeing play out across. I mean, we are seeing this in the Maldives, we're seeing it in Pakistan, where people are accused of blasphemy. In the Maldives, there are groups that are accusing them of insulting their religion. It is, we see this, of course, in India, where groups are running rampant because they're claiming to be outraged or wanting to protect their religion. But just to go back a bit to Pollock and what's happening in Bangladesh right now. When Pollock first got in touch with us about his father, I have to admit that we were terrified for other reasons. Because in Bangladesh today, the human rights violations that take place are so severe that for the average Bangladeshi, an outcome is often that they can be gum, which means disappeared, or crossfired, which means they'll be extrajudicially executed. So at the point when Kajol's motorbike was found outside and he had gone away, those were our primary fears at that point of time. So let us also understand where this contest comes from. This is, and I agree, it is not necessarily always ordered from the top. I don't think the Prime Minister's office is sitting there plucking off individuals and figuring out who's going to be disappeared and who's not going to be disappeared. But there exists a culture of impunity. There exists a culture where nobody is held accountable. And therefore, these kinds of actions are taken repeatedly, over and over again. So, you know, I just want to go back a bit and talk about where this sits in Bangladesh society. So when RAB was first created, the Rapid Action Battalion was first created, it was created as an anti-crime force and an anti-terror force. It went out in their dashing little black uniforms. And really, a lot of Bangladeshis were very appreciative because they were handling crime. Then came the spate of extrajudicial killings that happened, which were like the Philippines, a war on drugs. And again, there were Bangladeshis who were saying, oh, well, you know, it's kind of justified because these are, you know, creating problems with our youth. The question is, and this is not just a question in Bangladesh, but again, to bring it back to all of us, really, it is, when do we give up on our civil liberties? Why does it take a George Floyd before people come out on the streets? Why are we not more insistent on holding the standards? And unfortunately, we are not holding them. We've just seen an insane amount of custodial killing in Tamil Nadu and India. 2 men who were picked up and tortured to death because they violated COVID restrictions. Now, this level of impunity and security forces abuse has to be responded with a government that is committed to ending abuses instead of using security forces to allow for more crime. Now, what has happened in Bangladesh right now is that from the criminals and the drug dealers who were somehow acceptable when human rights violations occurred against them, it is now, then it came to political opponents, then it came to critics, and now a 15-year-old boy complaining on Facebook can end up in jail. So, you know, we don't, as Saad said, now it's such a slippery slope that no one knows what might cause offense, who might get affected, who might decide to complain, who might file a case, and how the police will respond. And that the police will immediately respond if it's someone powerful from the ruling party who, I mean, you know, for the 15-year-old child, it was you bad-mouthed our prime minister was what the police said. Now, and that it's that level of sort of breakdown of rule of law. And part of that is, as Stephen said earlier, is that this is such a problematic law that the interpretation can go anywhere. It is very similar. We actually argue about this in Pakistan as well, because, you know, where people are picked up for blasphemy, it's an arbitrary law. No one knows what might constitute blasphemy. But similarly here, we don't know what might be seen as insulting or to the first family, or insulting to the image of the country, or outrage somebody's sentiments. And therefore, what happens is it's creating a sort of chilling effect to the point where people are now speaking out. And again, to extend it backwards, what is happening, therefore, is there's not enough criticism of the ongoing human rights violations. And therefore, police and RAB and all these other security forces are often acting in a way that is uncontrolled. We don't know who picked up Kajol. Why was he picked up? No one has been held to account for the fact that this man was suddenly produced to the border on the India-Bangladesh border, apparently violating passport laws when he was in his own country. So, you know, I mean, the irrationality of these actions and the fact that no one is ever held to account. Case after case is filed against him. And all the others who are facing these kind of charges and allegations. Then there are all the people who are still disappeared, all the people who have been killed in custody. And I will end on this, that it is imperative at this point of time for the standards to be established again. You know, first there was the war on terror and people were being frightened so much, they were told that you must compromise on security and civil liberties because that's the only way we can keep you safe. So there can be surveillance. Yes, we can check on every little bit of WhatsApp forward that you have. And now that same thing has been used also in the pandemic, in a global pandemic. I mean, you know, now for COVID-19, again, we want to check your phones, we want to insert that data, you know, investigate your data, we can have surveillance. I think clinging to the civil liberties space, which also incorporates in it the freedom of religion and freedom of speech, because freedom of religion is not just the guy who's outraged. It is also the person who wants to criticize that religion. Similarly, freedom of speech can often not be very nice to hear, but you know, you hold the line, hold the international standards. And I will say this particularly to Bangladeshis who might be listening on Facebook or on this call, hold the standards, because if you do not, you will one day find someone who you love also in trouble without knowing. Because all this while, when it was happening to the BNP people and the Jamaat people, a lot of you Awami League supporters were not speaking up. Today, it's happening to your own people. Please speak up now. Challenge it. Ask your government to be rights respecting. Thank you.
Thank you, Meenakshi, for summing it up so well. And you were right. It's not just the top guys who are always at fault. It's the people who are often it's the people who are at the bottom of the ladder who are eager to please the ones who are higher up, and therefore they are the zealotry that comes out of the cadre, the wider base, the people who are the mob, often the mob, and the lower people in the lower end of the various institutions, the police, the judiciary, the fellow journalists, and various other people who are just too eager to score a point, whether against their rivals or to sort of please their respective bosses, and it becomes completely out of control, and nobody knows who is accountable. And it's from your point, I think we have a logical progression towards what Dr. Halima Begum will sort of talk about, which is the role of civil society, where you need to have a benchmark, you need to have a rule of law and a consensus and the involvement of the civil society, which in Bangladesh at the moment, what we can all see is that people are terrified to speak up, terrified to participate, terrified to come on board and publicly defend human rights and the dissenters who are being targeted now. Dr. Begum, can you hear me?
I can.
Hi.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, you've mentioned that civil society is it's obviously a bedrock of any kind of human rights system, any kinds of human rights regime that any country sort of needs to uphold. But the situation in Bangladesh is really, really dire. What is your prognosis of what's going on, and what does the future hold?
Thank you, Shukanta. Can you hear me? Okay. Just before I start, I just wanted to bring it back to Shafiqul Islam Kajol, because although it's one of many situations, we are here today to actually bring some support to his father, Pollock's father, and to make sure fundamentally that he gets released and he makes safe passage home with his family. So I just wanted to kind of bring us back to that point, because every time a Bangladeshi or another Bangladeshi like mine who has dual nationality talks about these issues, we're constantly thinking about safety, security, and we want to do this in a way that actually brings the Bangladeshi government with us and everybody in Bangladesh with us. And so I just wanted to put that out there. So what really, really appalls me about this dialogue today, other than the fact that it's an affront to human rights everywhere in Bangladesh and globally, is the fact that it's fallen down to journalists and the press to maintain freedom of expression and to maintain that space that is there for citizens to enjoy in Bangladesh. And I think, Salil, it was you that said, Bangladesh's legacy goes back to the need to create a society and an independent country where democracy could flourish, perhaps at a time in the early 1970s when we separated our identity away from a country that was articulated around religion, for example. So I would like all Bangladeshis and Bangladeshi leaders to actually think about honoring the values of Bangladesh when it was founded, because that is going to take us back to that safe place, a bold place where actually we will feel proud and honor what it is that Bangladesh stands for. So I think that's really important to kind of highlight, because I don't want all Bangladeshis listening to this conversation and dialogue and feeling as though this is a conversation against the state. No, this is part of Bangladeshis who want to own their own story and their own narratives, and getting our leaders to be accountable. It doesn't really matter which side of the political spectrum our leaders sit. What we want to see is an effective, accountable state, okay, so that our children can enjoy a future where they can breathe, they can speak. And it's interesting that Meenakshi spoke a little bit before around, this isn't a Bangladeshi issue, it's not a UK issue, it's a systemic issue. And I was actually going to talk a little bit about civil society and the role that civil society plays. But of course, the world at the moment is talking a lot about systemic inequality, structural inequality. And actually, you do have to take those conversations that the rest of the world is having and relate that back to Bangladesh as well. What we're discussing here is a loss of civil society space, civil society voice. This is very systemic. It's not to do with who just sits at the top. It's to do with the power of the population and citizens overall. And I remember as a development rookie about 15 years ago, I was quite proud to work in Bangladesh, because I was told that civil society in Bangladesh is vibrant, it's robust. Let's look next door to Pakistan or Nepal or Sri Lanka, where actually civil society was quite constrained. But 10 years on, I don't think I could feel as confident about the strength of civil society in Bangladesh. I think we've eroded that space. And I'd like all Bangladeshis, wherever we sit, whether it's in the economic space or the civil society space or in government seats or as an entrepreneur, why don't we claim back that space? Because without that space, our state is not going to be effective, not going to be accountable. And we'll always find ourselves in a situation where it falls on the journalists to hold up the freedoms. It falls on Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. And that's important for us. But for a country, that expression and that dissent, that platform should sit with the population. And I'm a little bit worried that as Bangladesh becomes, economically more and more successful, and, I think all of us want Bangladesh to be successful, but that rising inequality that's going to come with that economic growth means that poorer people and people who actually lack power are the ones that are going to suffer unless we can build up our civil society space. So I would love to urge everybody that's in this space, international actors, I'm speaking at international actors directly now, if we are in this space where we're considering retreating back to our G8 headquarters, because we feel as though Bangladesh is now very mature, it's prosperous, don't leave in an irresponsible way, because actually our civil society space in Bangladesh is not in that mature state where we can guarantee the rights of every citizen that doesn't have power, that doesn't understand how the rule of law works. And the arrests of Kajol and others like him is symptomatic of something broader than just political parties interfering in the process of law. We're actually eroding that civil society space. And I think it's really important that all of us actually shake up those international actors and their commitments as they retreat, thinking their job is done because they've all reduced this complex problem of poverty, for example, and that Bangladesh is now middle income and we could all go home and focus on another country. That is not the case with Bangladesh. Bangladesh is not China or India or Brazil. Yes, it's going to be economically successful, but we haven't had a strong history where our civil society can take its rightful place and hold our government to account. So my hope is that, we continue to put the pressure on international actors to make sure that as they retreat away from Bangladesh with their aid programs or whatever international cooperation engagements and instruments that we have, that we absolutely maintain that the government of Bangladesh protects civil liberties, protects human rights, invests in a civil society that can flourish for another 15 years. Because without that, it's an irresponsible retreat, because we are leaving ordinary people who can't buy the protection of law merciless, if you like. So I don't need to tell anybody in this panel or anybody who's listening how difficult it is to mobilize, to actually access any form of protection if you're in rural parts of Bangladesh. So my my hope is that we actually think about building civil society so that the state could be effective. The worst situation we want to see in 5 years' time is that an economically successful Bangladesh is thriving, but that state is not accountable to its people. So I would love for this conversation to focus also on how we make that state accountable. Then it doesn't feel personal. What we do know about Black Lives Matter, for example, what we do know about the conversations in the US is that institutional racism is not personal. It's the system that needs to course correct itself to allow all of us to enjoy our protections. And I think the more we try and politicize this dialogue around human rights, the more likely it is that government will get into an entrenched position and not open up that space. So we need to think about the institutions, the structures and the systems that need to flourish. And of course, civil society is a huge part of that. So my hope is that we start thinking about how we build the power of citizens. Now, I know that everybody on this panel is saying, well, actually, it's so hard to actually speak out. And it is, but if you don't invest in the systems and the structures that allow that safe space, then it will always be difficult. And we must think about more NGOs, not just BRAC, not just a few that are bright and seem to hold that space in Bangladesh. What about that smaller civil society space where actually in the rural areas, in the districts where we could actually see young people or other dissenting voices take place without a combative relationship with the government? That's what we need to grow. And I hope that we can lend our support to that. Of course, the immediate issue is thinking about getting safe release of Kajol and others like him, and that is really, really important. But equally, I would like to see an effective, accountable state so that we're not here at 10 years' time asking for the release of yet another political dissenter. It's become too combative, and that's not what Bangladesh is about. It's not what it's about. And I think we need to go back to our roots of what it was that we wanted: secular, democratic state where people's voices are cherished, and that's where we need to rewind back to.
Thanks, Halima. You summed it up so well. You sort of, civil society is an integral part, and it's always work in progress, as you rightly pointed out. And without the churn, democracies die terrible, slow deaths. Uh, and taking on from your points, we have Alana Travels. She's the chair of the Labour Campaign for Human Rights, which basically sensitizes the Labour Party of the UK to various human rights issues. Alana, you have been closely associated with, Kajol's initial disappearance and then, subsequent incarceration. You have sort of tried to popularize the issue, amplify the voice of Pollock via social media and your own platform. So tell us about how you went about, doing that and what you plan to do in the days ahead.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you everybody for some really interesting thoughts, and particularly Halima there. That was something to really think about. Yeah, I'll keep this short because I'm not an expert. I'm a campaigner. Like you said, I'm the vice chair of the Labour Campaign for Human Rights. So for those of you who are watching and might not know much about the UK political system, the Labour Party is one of the two major parties in the UK, and as a group, we exist to work with MPs to keep human rights issues at the heart of policy and practice, and to highlight issues of injustice around the globe. And I'll just give a tiny little backstory before I go into talking about what you just said. Earlier this year, we published a specific 40-page briefing on Bangladesh for Labour Party MPs, which is part of our Britain and Her Allies campaign, which is a kind of a series of briefings which focus on countries which the United Kingdom historically has kind of reasonably close economic, cultural, historical ties, and where there are quite serious human rights abuses. And it's sort of with the aim that we believe that these countries, there is some degree to which the UK can exercise diplomatic pressure to help end abuses where it can, and basically, yeah, the campaign aimed to raise awareness of those human rights abuses and identify where the British government is complicit to, or more frequently, frustratingly, just apathetic, and where we think the international community should be pushing harder, using their soft power and using their voice. Anyway, 5 of those recommendations. Last week, we recently produced a series of 21 policy proposals on Bangladesh for a Labour-controlled Foreign Office, and 5 were specifically on the issue of actively promoting human rights and freedom of expression in Bangladesh. So I thought I would just read out one, which is number 15, and it's kind of tied into what we've all been talking about, the role of the international community and the UK specifically in demanding that Bangladesh disclose the location and detention status of a list of abductees. I won't read the names out, but that it also investigates the disappearance of the journalist Kajol, and that the UK should promote freedom of expression in Bangladesh, and call for an end to using the Digital Security Act to prosecute those who hold critical opinions, or to also block websites simply because they publish material critical of it or members of the governing party. And panelists have already discussed this in depth, but I think it's just worth quickly stressing before we close how far democracy and its many instruments like the legal and judicial system, the free press, free speech, have deteriorated in Bangladesh. And our campaign standpoint is that while Bangladesh has made advancements in certain areas over the past decade or so in the economy and literary rates and that sort of thing, literacy rates, this is completely overshadowed by the growing abuse of human rights. And anyway, we believe it's vital the international community speaks up and out about these issues and actually talks the talk when it comes to such flagrant abuses of rights. And yeah, through collaboration and partnership, but also criticism. And obviously, although the UN have urged Bangladesh to also investigate Kajol's suspected enforced disappearance and review the DSA, the journalist remains illegally detained in jail. And it's a very striking example of anyway, the challenges and the abuses in the country. And the Labour campaign for human rights, like you said, have been working over the past 2 months to try to increase awareness of Kajol's disappearance and detainment, writing several updates to MPs and getting as many members of parliament to call for his release, including Stephen Kinnock MP, who holds the current brief of Shadow Foreign Minister for Asia. We've written to the FCO and the Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, published 2 articles on the case, and more detailed briefing notes for parliamentary use. And also we continue to cover the issue on social media to draw wider attention to it. And I think it's probably worth just stressing and sort of vaguely concluding on that point that actually the agency of those of us who are lucky enough to have it, and to speak out against what's going on is so important that we use it. And obviously social media is one common thing that we can all do, regardless of our personal, political, professional standing. And I hope Pollock won't mind me saying this, but he's been running a very tremendous and brave and inspiring campaign calling for his father's release. And the very least that we can all do, people who are hopefully watching this across the world, is to support it and share it and continue to speak up and speak out against very flagrant and concerning abuses. And I think also, it's just my personal opinion, but I've always sort of thought that one of the best ways to sort of try and enact change is actually to focus on specific examples of cases and push for justice where and when you can. And this is an outrageous example, obviously, of that wider systemic failure. But I really hope that the extraordinary breaches in justice and the legal sort of proceedings that we've seen, especially over the past few weeks and this morning, will ultimately draw such criticism that they become untenable. And I think I just want Pollock and the wider campaign to know that we are with you, and we will maintain our interest and our activity and our attention. And thank you very much as well for a very well moderated discussion. It's been great to hear from everybody. Yeah.
Thank you, Alana. I just had some questions. So as you've all spoken about the broader scenario, I will have to say that my idea initially, as you can understand, it was like 4 months from now, I was not thinking about doing this. Everyone was thinking about reading about the COVID situation. But right now, what I'm, like even today, it is the 111th day now. Like my journey, it has been the same. And today I'm particularly most shaken because the remand, it just doesn't make sense to me. Mostly because first my father was disappeared for 53 days. We did not know whether he was alive. We don't know who took him. Someone definitely did, but we don't know why. We don't know who. I didn't ask for that accountability. Even when he was missing, I only asked my father to be back home, alive, safe, and as soon as possible. But the sad part is, it took 53 days of disappearance of my father to finally have him resurface. But again, it took another 52 days in jail without being arrested in a proper case. He was serving time before being sentenced. He was shown arrested 105 days after the case was filed. The Digital Security Act case 1 at Sher Anglanagor. He was already in jail for 52 days. Why the remand now? That is a question that I would like answer to whoever can tell me. Because you want someone in remand, you already have them in jail for 52 days. Everything, like, it doesn't make sense. You want to arrest him, you could have done it. He was already in jail, but the technical ground we were even denied. We couldn't ask for bail. When we did, the reference were given to the Digital Security Act cases, but when we moved for bail, the applications were denied, the hearings were not given. My father's bail applications have been denied a total of 8 times now. It has never been approved. Like the first time when they put the Section 54 detention under suspicion without a warrant, it obviously didn't make much sense because everyone knew whatever was about him. Like if they want to arrest my father under the Digital Security Act cases, they could have done it in Dhaka. Let us at least be with him for 1 day. But even if we overlook that, the Section 54 says you are allowed a maximum 15 days of detention. In my father's case, the Section 54 stayed for 18 days. When we asked for bail twice in that case, which is a bailable case, it was denied twice, once on the 16th day, surpassing the legal limit. But even in all of this time, like they never showed him arrested in a particular case. The remand, it is just like I am completely off axis right now. I just cannot think properly about anything. It is just not making sense. The one thing that my father ended before hanging up was that I think they're going to hit me, they're going to torture me, do something if you can. Like it's not even about like the torture that is worrying me, it's about what can I actually do. Even as the remand news like spread like wildfire, I didn't like ask for why the remand or anything. I only asked like what do I do now? I didn't even ask accountability from anyone else, not any political party, not the international NGOs, not the general public. Like if someone could at least guide me to say what I should do, even that would be great. 110 days before now, the first time the journalists started asking what is our comment with my father's disappearance, the comment still stays same. Now 57 days off his incarceration. The comment is still the same. My mother, my younger sister, we all started with saying, we don't know what happened, who took him. That is not our focus. That is not the answers we want. We don't want answers till now. That is not our focus. We only want our family member back. I want my father back. My mother wants her husband back. Like, is that too much to ask? I don't know how many times we can say it. We can't tolerate it anymore. My family, my mother, my younger 11-year-old sister, We don't want any answers. We don't have any demands. We're only appealing to the government and anyone who is in the power or can help us just to get our father back to us alive. Because I don't know how much long he can keep this up. Thank you, Anshukanta. You can take over for now.
Yes, Paulo, we completely understand what you must be going through. It's very, very difficult to be in your shoes at the moment. We probably cannot, but we can only offer our solidarity, absolute solidarity with you and others, other families like yours who are going through the same pain of separation and seeing their loved ones, behind bars or just suddenly vanishing from their lives all of a sudden. Uh, you know, we will hold a little bit of Q&A now. I mean, free-flowing questions. I will sort of pose a question to maybe Saril Tripathi, who can sort of, bring back the sort of, Saril, you were the chair of Writers in Prison Committee, and while Pen International does a fantastic job of recording and expressing solidarity and sort of generating international pressure every time writers and dissenters and authors are targeted by respective governments, uh, do you think that there is enough? I mean, do you think if there is enough legal protection and constitutional protection, accorded to people whose livelihoods are tied to freedom of expression and freedom of speech? It's both a matter of labor. It's both an economic question as well as a question of having human rights and fundamental rights of free speech and expression. Uh, do you think that writers and journalists are given enough protection in whether it's Bangladesh, whether it's America, the UK, and democracies as such?
So there are two parts to the question, because there is the human rights community loves to always say that human rights are universal, inalienable, complementary, and interdependent, and so on. But there is a tension. I mean, it's most visible in European law, where Article 8 and 10 do clash with each other. One is about freedom of expression, and the other is about privacy. And clearly, there is a clash there. The US goes very far in one direction, which is the side I like. The First Amendment, which prevents the state from what it can and cannot do. I mean, about how much it can regulate free speech, and that's a good thing. But it doesn't do the same for private sector, and which is why Twitter and Facebook can take down our pages, and there's no real legal recourse to that. I mean, that's something worth bearing in mind. That Britain also has the public interest doctrine under the Reynolds rule, as it is called, which came up in the time of what is public and not. Now, in the Indian context and Bangladeshi context, in the South Asian context, I know the Indian law better, which is the whole Article 19.1 and 19.2, the exception to it, that yes, there is freedom of speech, but, and then that but includes a whole host of things you cannot say. Offending neighbors, there's whole the Scheduled Caste and Scheduled Tribes Atrocity Act in India, which is now being used against Supriya Sharma in Scroll, and which is even a non-bailable offense. It's not even a question of bailability, and it goes way beyond. So there are all kinds of countervailing pressures, and the whole whether it was the old 66A in India versus 57 in Bangladesh, similarity again, about what you can say, even if you like. I mean, I remember in India, there were two young women who one woman had said something about city closing down in Mumbai after Bal Thackeray died, and another woman clicked the like on it, and that was enough for the two of them to get arrested. Of course, later things change, and in subcontinent, the process becomes the punishment. It's whether or not your case comes up at the end is a different matter. It's just a time. I mean, what Kajol is going through now, is an example of that. 100 days, 50 days, nobody knew whether he was around, and the other 50 days where he's a guest of the state, an unwilling and an involuntary guest of the state. So my point is, of all these examples, is to show that everywhere where you talk about freedom of expression, states will want to impose restraint. Now, some restraints are legitimate when it comes to incitement of violence, but the rest of them do fall apart. But the consequence of all of that is that the legal environment is such that it does impose restrictions. There's no unrestrained freedom. Unfortunately, is what I would say. I mean, there should be, of course, civil damages, and I completely agree with what Stephen says. Penn has a campaign on that too, about outlawing criminal defamation. Should, of course, never be there. No one should. In Africa, we have a big campaign going on that. So yes, it should be there. It is not there. There will be restraints, and the worst part is, and the threat of the non-state actor, that it's no longer the state which is going to go after you. The bloggers in Bangladesh I mentioned were killed by non-state actors. In India, we have Gauri Lankesh and cases like that who were killed by non-state actors. In Pakistan, too, Sabine's case, the famous case in Karachi, was a non-state actor who killed her. So, I mean, these are the kind of issues that we have to grapple with, and that's the sad reality.
Yeah. Stephen, CPJ has been sort of documenting instances of journalists being targeted across the board, whether it's whether it's South Asia, America, currently also in Brazil, people are getting targeted. Russia, China, stellar examples of persecuting authors of all sorts, journalists specifically. Do you see a pattern? That 21st century was supposed to be this utopia of expression with technology, platforms like Facebook, Twitter, opening up vistas and democratizing expression, as it were. But instead, what we are witnessing is sort of a complete clampdown and control of who can speak what, and on top of that, we also have the menace of fake news. And interestingly, state can always say that a particular example of excellent reportage is just fake news. So you have these clashing forces which are sort of which are really bogging down journalism, which is already facing a massive crisis, existential crisis, as it were, from these technology giants. What do you see? I mean, what do you see? What is the way out? And do you see any sort of a solution for people who sort of live by their words, as it were?
You've raised a very profound issue, and I think that originally it was considered that social media, Facebook, Twitter, and all this would give everyone an equal voice. But what I think the pioneer in defeating that premise is China. That China has deployed the technology to monitor and censor and imprison people very swiftly when they go against this. And I think China has given inspiration to other countries that have had more open systems. And you see reflections of this certainly in Vietnam, but you see a different kind of problem, say, in the Philippines, where the government has really weaponized social media to attack journalists and other people, who speak out. And I think that Bangladesh is in a sense treading down that path. Certainly in Pakistan has attempted to introduce legislation and rules to govern what takes place in the online space. And this is really the wave of the future. I don't think we have an answer to this. I think it was positive very recently when Facebook has begun labeling political posts by the President of the United States as against their rules or and violent. But it's really just a first step. But I want to make one other point. Frankly, the international human rights community and the press freedom community is overwhelmed by the sheer number of cases that are taking place around the world, and it's we think, or we believe, that we can make a difference when we focus and bring a tremendous amount of attention. I mean, attention to something. For example, the case of Maria Ressa in the Philippines, and I have to say, Pollock has been incredibly successful at bringing attention to his father's case, which would not have happened had he not taken that action. And I think there's enough international attention that we may be able to, increase the pressure there. Because if you looked at what happened in the case of Shahidul Alam, I mean, there was a tremendous cry, and he was eventually, released released from jail. And I think that has to be the goal, in this case, that the international community floods the space with information and appeals that are eventually embarrassing to the Bangladesh government. And hopefully when that happens, reason might prevail. And this can happen, we try to do this in China, but actually there's a case, I don't even want to mention the person's name, but there's a case of an imprisoned journalist in China who is facing a lot of health issues, and he had a very difficult condition. We understand that the international pressure hasn't got him out of jail, but it has improved the conditions under which he's been imprisoned. So there is hope, going down this path of bringing attention, from the international community.
The next question is both for Saad and Meenakshi, as representatives of Human Rights Watch and Amnesty. What do you sort of, how do you sort of foresee, democracies in South Asia progressing, in terms of what we are sort of witnessing? And Meenakshi just pointed out, there has been a sort of a deterioration across the board. And not just in South Asia, but otherwise also. But freedom of expression in South Asia has taken a sort of turn for the worse, and people are extremely fearful. As human rights organizations, international organizations, what are your thoughts on South Asia?
Saad, you want to go first?
I'll go after you start, Meenakshi.
Sorry. Before I start, I just wanted to flag some things that Pollock has raised, because I think we need to keep this in mind. In terms of COVID and the risks to people in custody, this is something that the UN Human Rights Commissioner has already said, that the prison populations must be taken care of. People should be released from detention. And in Bangladesh, really a large number, almost 80% of the people in Bangladesh prisons are actually under trial. They've not been convicted. Like Kajol, these are people who are in custody. And really, these prisons are extremely overcrowded. There is not enough health care available in the hospitals. So even for reasons of COVID-19 international response, Bangladesh authorities should be releasing all these people. Kajol is not a flight risk. He has already been in custody for a long period. He should now be released in any event, even if there are cases that the state has against him that he must be prosecuted for. He should be released on bail for health reasons. I just wanted to flag that, because I think that really is the family's primary concern, and it is actually a concern for families of many people, many families whose people are in custody right now. On the freedom of expression space, I think the concern really is why is it that, at this point of time in South Asia, we have a series of extremely popular leaders. A large number of them have come in they've been elected with great numbers. So the insecurity of a popularly elected leadership is particularly concerning, because these are people who do enjoy mass support. So then for them to be so sensitive to criticism is really surprising and odd. But they're also abusing that popularity in a way to impose their views in a way. So there is also the fact that they are popularly elected, and yet they want to sort of establish that popularity even further by silencing anyone else who might criticize them. And I'll go back to what Halima said earlier. In any democracy, if there isn't space for civil society, that democracy starts to fail, because the very notion of civil society in some ways is to create the space for correction. the most rights respecting government still needs people, the space for dissent that will then lead to better rights. So even for that purpose, this sort of crackdown on civil society, this crackdown on speech is extremely concerning, and hope will be reversed.
I'll take the cue from Meenakshi and just add to what she has said that indeed across South Asia, we're seeing that all the representatives of the government or the heads of the states are populist leaders, and it's very surprising the way that their actions are reflected on the people. It's very unfortunate. In India, we're seeing various laws such as UAPA being used against individuals. Safura Zargar is one of them. Bangladesh is largely the discussion here. So if I remain more focused in Bangladesh's situation, it's indeed very grim the way that people are persecuted. And I think there are many reflections over here that I've seen. One is the divisiveness within the party. It's not just the proponents of the government or the opposition. It's within the party itself that there are divisions, and some of these cases have reflected those situations as well, where political leaders have tried to help victims and have failed in the process because there's someone else who's more influential in the party. It's become an issue of power struggle within the party, and that's very unfortunate. And it's important to realize that these are happening because of laws like this. When you have a law that you do not have a control over for long, it can get against you, and that's something when I don't think our political leadership has taken a lesson or a note of. The ICT Act, when it was enacted by a different government. It has come back at them. And it could happen the same way for political leaders who are now in power. So what's the purpose of these kind of laws? You will be opposing it. When this government came into power in 2008, there was a lot of repression that people have gone through, had experienced, and which is why this change had come through. They're tired of the way actions were carried out by some of the security forces, the extrajudicial executions that the government today had committed to abolish, to disband the security agencies that have been responsible for many of the allegations of extrajudicial executions. And not only that there has not been investigation into those allegations, it has continued. Similarly, when we're talking about freedom of expression, the crackdown that we're seeing now is quite unprecedented. Then the numbers are only increasing. It's just been 2 years of this law, and we're seeing this. In 5 years, when the ICT Act was there were 700 cases that were filed against people. And I think we should still be optimistic. Like I said, that yes, the senior leadership of the political structure might not be aware about the incidents that are happening, the cases that are being filed. It's difficult to micromanage in this kind of situation, and which is what's becoming a shame and embarrassment for the party as well, for the government, for the state. And we must also see that state and the government and the ruling party could be different, as in the political parties could be different, and all these actors have a responsibility towards the people. They've come here to serve the people. Let's not even go into the process of election and democracy at this stage, but even for the right of the people, I think it's very important that these laws are abolished and turned in a way that they are people friendly and rights respecting.
Right. You just mentioned something that the parties themselves, the party cadre itself is sort of unhinged to the moment, and they sort of, they're sort of doing things on their own, often without following the proper protocol or sort of, trying to impress the higher ups and the authorities. Now, Halima and Alana, Question for you, civil, I mean, what I've observed, in sort of South Asia and as well as parallels in both America and UK, is that we are becoming more of an electioneering democracies. I mean, all our democratic energies and focused on just winning or ensuring electoral victories, and beyond that, we are completely neglecting institutions which are getting weakened every day. Laws are, the laws that are existing on paper, in the books, are not being implemented, and of course, civil society is sort of, while being weakened, is sort of ceding space to a sort of an electoral machinery of constant politicking of an electoral nature, and not politicking of a civil, where civil rights and human rights and expression and progressive nature of democracy, is sort of is fostered and is sharpened and is honed. Definitely, that is the case in India, parallels in Bangladesh, definitely in Pakistan. So to some extent, also in UK and America at the moment, that we are becoming electoral democracies, and all our energies, our commentary, and our sort of direction, sort of a social direction is geared towards who will win the next election, and not how are we going to sort of become better democracies with more rights, stronger rights, and more expanded rights, and more inclusive rights for everybody. What do what are your ideas on this? And what, of course, what do you think? What is the way out of this impasse that we are currently witnessing across the board?
It's a big question. Yeah, well, like you said, in the UK, we had an election in December. So I think that's changed a little bit for us personally, because there's 4 years now of our current government. But you're right, the lens of who is electorally popular, the tyranny of the majority, as I think we sometimes call the electorate in the UK at least, dominates political discourse. What is the mainstream opinion? And in terms of human rights in the UK, it's obviously a completely different situation, but we highly anticipate that the current government will attempt to repeal the Human Rights Act in the next 3 to 4 years. It's high on their policy agenda, and so as an organisation, I mean, we've got different things going on at the moment, but one of our domestic aims is to keep making the argument, not just the legal argument, but the very practical way that the Human Rights Act genuinely helps individuals to sort of claim some kind of ownership, and then equally as well the moral authority that gives a country to speak out against human rights abuses in other parts of the world. I mean, I suppose Halim is probably best placed to talk about this in regards to Bangladesh, but I liked your question, because immediately I saw parallels between a series of countries, and it's incredibly concerning. I guess the best thing, or one of the ways that we can try to fight back against that mindset and mentality, is to just keep having the conversations, making the arguments, like in terms of LCHR, speaking about these issues, writing briefings and articles, and sort of stepping back. We all, the Labour Campaign for Human Rights is somewhat kind of, ironically, it is actually partisan, because we are tied to the Labour Party. But I think, within the UK, particularly, I think in certain instances like Brexit, and even in response to COVID, everything is seen through some kind of electoral lens, and it's worrying. It sort of waffled on there, but I'm afraid I don't really have the answers, apart from we need to be aware that slow sort of descent is very much happening, and try to sort of create unity where we can.
Can I? Oh, sorry, just jump in there. that question is really important because it's not just a question for Bangladesh, right? So machine politics, electioneering, that seems to be the focus of every country, whatever the status of their economy. So I think there's a consistency there in Bangladesh, South Asia, the rest of the world. I've been struggling a little bit actually thinking, why is it that 15 years ago, you know, Bangladesh civil society was something that we were all proud of, and why is it 15 years later we're now looking at excessive, intense repression? And I've got to say, it's not just something that happens in Bangladesh. Bangladesh is economically becoming very successful now. So my thoughts are with that 8% growth that we're seeing in Bangladesh, what has happened to other countries in the past that have become economically successful? What's followed there has been inequalities and levels of inequalities that have been actually quite bad for human rights in general. So it made me think a little bit around, you know, why is it that in the UK or in America or in the Brazils of the past, rising economic growth and inequality that has come with it has actually created more human rights abuses? So if we want to tackle this, I think we need to get away from the politics of it all. Irrespective of which party is in power, if there's excessive inequality, I think we're likely to see more and more human rights abuses. And because it's an inequalities issue, I think we need to take a step back and start thinking about building more just, equitable and equal societies. With it comes civil society. So I'm afraid Bangladesh is not an exception here. This is what happened in Brazil in the 1980s. This is what happened in the rest of Latin America. This is what's happening in Trump's US. So I actually think we need to talk about inequality, which is going to have a profound impact on Bangladesh's prosperity, but with that, a profound impact on human rights abuses. Because as the middle class grows, the middle class becomes demanding, excessively demanding, far more than poorer communities. And when you demand more, but the government isn't able to deliver on those demands, it becomes quite difficult to manage. And actually, that's a problem that China faces at the moment: growing middle class, rising inequalities. What do they do? So I actually think it's not a political issue, it's how you manage inequalities, and we have to do that in a concerted way without focusing on the politics. Because if we focus on the politics, you get the clashes, and actually the citizen loses out.
I think sort of sums it up. If anybody has sort of any closing comments, please go ahead.
I just have one thing to say to my people, and I'll say it in Bengali. বাবা যখন বলে যে আমাকে রিমান্ডে মনে হয় অনেক মারবে, তখন কেমন লাগে?
Are you going to say that in English also for our other viewers?
No, I don't think it's needed.
Let me translate that. What Pollock is saying, that if his dad is harmed, it's a very he doesn't even know how he will feel, and it's this incomprehensibility of this situation. What the family goes through is the most terrifying lesson. It's the most somber lesson of it all. I mean, we can all politicize, we can all talk about the issues at hand, but it is the family that is always at the front line of pain. And Pulok, we are all with you, and I'm sure international pressure always, as Stephen Butler rightly pointed out, international pressure does help, and it at least helps to improve the conditions and keeping the person alive, the dissenter alive. And we are all with you, and definitely we expect that the pressure will make the authorities see the right, the right thing to do, and hopefully your father will be free, and we will definitely celebrate that day. But till that day comes, we are going to carry on with your campaign, with a very brave campaign, and we are all with you at this moment. And as much solidarity that we can provide for you at the moment. It's not enough, but we are with you. Thank you, everybody, for this very enlightening discussion. And with that, we come to an end of this discussion. Thank you all. Thank you, Polo.